Hi, friends. Welcome to class. You thought you got rid of me. You were wrong. Um, Today, we are going to get ready to read Book 8 of Confessions. This week, you're only reading half of Book 8, but I want to give you some things to kind of keep at the front of your mind as we start working through this. Augustine's life is kind of coming to this climactic moment. So much of his life has been changing recently. He's pursued his desires as far as he kind of can, and now he's starting to have this pivot point. And so I want to set us up well to be able to read Book 8 and get a lot of the meat out of it. So let's do a quick recap of some of the bits of our story so far and get an idea of the kind of things we need to be paying attention to. So we're going to start off, we're going to talk about desires. Of course, this is going to be stuff that you guys are already really familiar with. So desires are, as you are well aware, at the forefront of Augustine's mind as he talks about his life, right? And one of the things we've been hitting on a ton is this idea that desires are things that need to be ordered. Desires aren't necessarily bad, but when they are disordered is whenever they start becoming problems. And that's really where sin comes from. For Augustine, sin isn't a thing, as in like a substance or this like entity. Sin is desire that is wrong. Remember, and this is the orc thing that we've been talking about a lot. It's depravity. It's something that has been changed to the way that it shouldn't be, right? These things need to be corrected. And this is why Augustine, as we talked about in the last little bit, talks a lot about this idea of bitter food. God has been feeding Augustine what he calls bitter food through his disordered desires, even as Augustine pursues things like fame and wealth and sex outside of marriage, all of these things. As he's pursuing them, God slowly starts turning them into bitter food so that now these things that once gave Augustine such satisfaction, actually through those sins, he's realizing these aren't satisfying anymore. And he identifies that as something God is doing, actually using his sin to correct him. The way that God is correcting and changing these desires, putting them back in the order they need to be in, is through making them taste bad. And it's a big deal for Augustine for this story. Augustine has two big desires, right? The first one is this eloquence and kind of the fame that comes with eloquence. As a kid, right, his parents are like, yes, go get rich. It's going to be great. As he grows up, all of his friends are like, let's show off. The person who is able to speak the best is the coolest in the friend group, right? And so eloquence becomes a thing that allows Augustine to, quote unquote, be better than other people. Well, what have we seen? As Augustine moves through life, he gets this perfect job in Milan. He is writing these crazy speeches for super important people. He went to school in Rome, for crying out loud, but now it's become bitter food. All of this stuff that was, his dream suddenly is meaningless to him. The other thing we see Augustine longing for is love. We have that beautiful line, and I think it's in Book 2. All he desires is loving and being loved. This is the height of Augustine's goals. I just want to feel loved. Well, one of the ways that shows up for Augustine's life is sex. Augustine pretty quickly equates, if I can have sex, that's how I know that I am being loved. And that becomes his desire. And again, what happens? As he's pursued this, he's gotten basically as much sex as he wants. He's rich and he's famous. He can have all the girls he wants. And once again, it becomes bitter food. This thing that he thought would bring him something ends up feeling kind of meaningless. And by the end of Book 6, he's asking these questions about marriage, and he's worried about it, but also what he has right now doesn't feel right. And suddenly marriage seems to be something that could help, but he's just not sure. This bitter food, again, is correcting his desires. So it's here we want to pivot the conversation away from just desire and more into the realm of truth. What is truth meaning for Augustine? What is his journey in pursuing truth? What has it looked like so far? And that's going to be important again for what happens in Book 8. Starting out, Augustine is primarily concerned with just please, for the love of God, just think that I'm cool. Just think that I'm meaningful. I will look smart as long as it means that I have people who care about me. Augustine is actually intelligent. One of the things we've talked about, a problem Augustine runs into, he's often the smartest guy in the room. And so he starts pursuing truth just because he wants to look cool. But then after he joins the Manichees, he gets to this spot where, man, the Manichees are just disappointing, right? He meets Faustus, this guy who's supposed to be the greatest of all the Manichees. And, oh, man, like, why are we even doing this? This guy's an idiot. Augustine can talk circles around him, can think circles around him. And so suddenly just being able to sound cool, Augustine realizes with Faustus, man, this is kind of meaningless. I feel really empty. And so he has this big epiphany about 12 years before Book 8, where he says, I am going to devote my life, all of my life, to seeking wisdom. That's the only thing I want to do. And so he kind of casts off this sophistry, just this desire to just sound cool and speak eloquently. And he says, I just want to pursue wisdom. And that shift is huge for Augustine. This is going to totally change the trajectory of his life. He no longer, maybe not, doesn't care about looking cool, but the goal of his life is now much more directed toward understanding the world. So truth has run in his pursuit of truth, Augustine's run into a few things. Number one, we talked about last week, was Christianity. Right, Augustine recognizes he wants to pursue it. He thinks it's, maybe there's a part of him that thinks it's cool, thinks it's good, but he's got these straw men in his mind, right? There's part of Augustine that's like, well, I can't worship three gods. Well, the idea that evil is like a substance. We talked about this, like there's like a good jelly and a bad jelly that's just all over the world, right? That's crazy. That doesn't make any sense. He has all of these ideas that he thinks about the Catholic faith that are just not true. It's not what Christians actually think. But those straw men are actually keeping him away from becoming a Christian. Well, the next big jump, as we talked about last week, is Platonism. Suddenly, all of Book 7 is concerned with Augustine being shown Platonism, actually diving into this. What he realizes, wow, this makes way more sense than Manichaeism. I mean, compared to what I was thinking about, what the Manichees told me the universe was like and what the substances were like, that's ridiculous now. Platonism gives him all of these new categories to think about the world in. And what becomes really interesting here is that because of those new categories, Christianity starts to become an option, right? Once he can think about substances like Plato thinks about substances, it clicks for him that God could be triune. Talking about God dwelling in a body doesn't seem as gross as it did in Manichaean thought. Platonism has opened his mind, given him new categories to actually think about the world that makes Christianity not as gross. It starts tearing down some of those straw men. And of course, we would be remiss if we talked about Augustine's pursuit of truth without mentioning Ambrose. Ambrose is the bishop in Milan. If you remember last week, this is the guy who Monica, Augustine's wife, is like, Ambrose is the reason my son's not a Manichae anymore. If you remember, Augustine desperately wants to have more conversations with Ambrose, to just talk shop with him, to talk theology with him. Ambrose is always super busy. But I want you to think about the other role Ambrose starts to play in Augustine's pursuit of truth. Augustine's dad was kind of a bum. I mean, we don't get a ton of stories about him. The stories we do hear about him, he seems kind of crude. There's that story where Augustine's dad sees him naked and just starts talking about how grateful he is for his son's sexual prowess, basically. His dad wants him to become really rich, and that's it. His dad kind of embodies all of the things that Augustine doesn't like about himself. Those desires that are super disordered are kind of embodied in his dad. His dad's not a great dude. The other like male figure in Augustine's life was Faustus, right? This is the guy who's like, he's gonna like show me, he can be my mentor and show me truth, and I can finally understand more of reality. And yet he was also kind of a letdown. And so now these two figures, these two male figures who are kind of mentors for Augustine, we find that they're both kind of gross. They're both really unhelpful. But it's when he gets to Milan, he meets Ambrose. And Ambrose is intelligent. He can read without speaking, right? He's this guy who's wanted by everybody because they want him to help him. He kind of has all of these things that Augustine wants, including one of the things that he doesn't know he wants, right? He's chaste. He's not married. He's celibate. And Everything that Augustine thinks he wants is kind of what his dad was like, but Ambrose is kind of the opposite of that. Ambrose is everything we see Augustine becoming. And so through Ambrose, yes, he's able to study truth more, but he also gets this new and better father figure that's going to end up shaping the rest of his life. So it's here that I want to talk about the outside. And I'll explain what I mean. When we read Augustine, one of the things we've been noting is Augustine's inward focus, right? Augustine said back in book 5, right? All of the creatures, all of humans, if they would just look in themselves, look inside, they would see that what they desire is God. They would see that God is in them. And this is where we talked about this idea that for Augustine, all creatures are longing to know God, whether or not they know it. And so if you can recognize who you actually are, you will then learn what it means to love God and to be fulfilled, right? Our hearts are restless until they rest in you. They're unquiet until they rest in you. Why is that? Well, it's because our hearts naturally long for their creator. They long for communion with the triune God. And until they get that, it's gross. And so Augustine says we have to look inward, and something about looking inward is actually going to show us what God is like. But for Augustine, the change that happens in our heart to make us able to see God on the inside is not something that can come from us, right? We can't just examine ourselves enough in order to be able to find God. No, something has to happen to us in order to make us able to pursue inside, to look inside and find God in there. The way I like to say it is there is an inward change, but for Augustine, that has to come from outward forces. Augustine cannot change himself. Things happen to him. God happens to him. And as that happens, then he can, his heart changes and he can start actually begin that journey inward, seeing what he actually is like. Look at these examples. Augustine has all of these things acting on him. His mom is following him everywhere and praying like crazy. Remember, he is the son of tears. She is praying constantly for him, and we're seeing that those prayers are starting to do something to him. As we've already mentioned, God is feeding him bitter food. All of these things that Augustine used to crave and to pursue, suddenly they're meaningless to him. The line I gave last week, right? You can never be truly depressed until your dreams come true. Augustine has that moment. His dreams come true. He has the job, he has the ladies, and he's empty, and it's hurting him. God is feeding him bitter food from the outside, changing him on the inside. Augustine keeps having friends who are dying or almost dying. And that's really messing with him, especially his friend who dies, quote unquote, is baptized. And then when he comes to, he becomes a Christian. That's this really crazy moment for Augustine. And he's just got other friends that are dying. Conceptions of what life is and what death is are starting to have their effect on Augustine. We met Alypius, and Alypius has this wild addiction to the games. And Augustine is watching this guy have this addiction to the circuses, and he can't fathom why he would do something so self-destructive. And it's in that process that Augustine is beginning to see what his own desires are doing to him, his own his own pursuit of just unbridled lust, his own pursuit of fame are doing the same things to him that Alypius's pursuit of the games is doing to him, right? He's starting to get new categories to think about how our desires are affecting us and breaking us. Platonism is shown to him. He finds it, and this outside force of Platonism starts shaping him in his mind and his categories, the kind of things he can think about. And then again, finally, Ambrose. He meets this new kind of father figure, and through Ambrose is going to start saying things to Augustine that are going to start messing with him, going to start changing the way he thinks about the world, start pricking his heart a little bit so that he can become more open to the things that God is doing. My point being, Augustine is not on the verge of conversion because he's just thought enough about the world. Augustine is on the verge of conversion because God has been doing all of this stuff through the people around him, through the ideas, even through his own sin, in order to change Augustine's heart so that he can start that journey inward to find God, in quote unquote, find God in himself, right? Remember book 1. There's that poem in book 1. In living creatures such as this, everything is wonderful and worthy of praise. One of the primary words that stands out in this poem is this idea of gift. Augustine is going to go on to say, the intellect that I have, it is not something I created, it's a gift from my God. My eloquence is not something that I built up, it's a gift from my God. But what we're finding is that for Augustine, conversion is also a gift. It is not something Augustine's earned. It's not something that he's just pursued hard enough and so he was able to find it. The only reason he was able to come away from his sins and to realize how much his disordered desires were affecting his heart is because God gave him all of these people and all of these bitter foods and all of these ideas. God gave them to him. For Augustine, his ability to even consider following Jesus is a gift from the Holy Spirit. God has given it to him. A way you can kind of think of it, because of all of these people around him, Augustine ultimately has the call to make, right? It's his call to follow Jesus or not. But God has been stacking the deck. He's been making sure that there are certain cards in play that are going to affect Augustine. I think one of the most beautiful versions of this, again, is his mother's prayer, right? As his mother has been praying over and over for Augustine, we see God starting to put things in Augustine's way that are going to make it really hard for him to say no. I mean, it seems to be his call, but God's stacking the deck. And he's stacking the deck in Augustine's favor for him to find him. This conversion is a gift. It's a gift from God. I want you to remember the steps of love that we talked about last week. We talked about how before you become a Christian, you love yourself for the sake of yourself, right? I want to take care of myself because I look out for myself, and so I love myself just so I don't die. The second thing is whenever you first hear the gospel, right, maybe you love Jesus for the sake of yourself. Fire insurance, right? I want to make sure that I don't go to hell and that I live forever. I'm loving God for my sake. The third step is this moment where you suddenly start to love God for God's sake. You realize God's beauty and magnificence, and you no longer just love God because of what he did for you, but because of who he is. You just love God for his own sake. But if you remember the fourth one, this is Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard of Clairvaux argues that the hardest version of love, this fourth step, is to be able to love yourself for God's sake. We tied this to the idea of theosis, right? An idea set up by Athanasius. We are slowly becoming divine. In Christ, the divine became man so that man might become divine. We are slowly being shaped into the image of Jesus, becoming more and more like God. And so at the end of the day, we have to ask, what does God do? What is the most Christ-like thing you can do? It's to love you, right? The more you become like Jesus, the more you will actually learn to love yourself for his sake. And what we see God doing in Augustine is shaping Augustine to be able to love himself. And this is where the idea of love or disordered love is a really big deal, right? Augustine, at the beginning of the book, when he's just robbing the pear tree, right? Or when he's just running after women left and right, Augustine seemingly loves himself, right? He is trying to do whatever he can in order to fulfill his own desires. But as we're moving through the story, God is shaping Augustine so that he is becoming more able to see who he really is. And as he becomes more like God, he can actually learn to love who he actually is. Who he actually is a person who doesn't need to do crazy things to get people to like him. Who he actually is a person of value who doesn't need tons of women in order to be validated. Who he is a person who is actually intelligent, who doesn't need other people's approval. God is shaping Augustine to learn how to actually love himself for who God says he is, to learn to love himself for God's sake. And so the question sitting at the edge of book 8 as we begin to read is simply, who are you? To be able to answer this question for Augustine is ultimately the main question you need to answer in order to follow Jesus. If you think yourself a person who is purely only has value as you get other people to like you, or only has value insofar as you can prove yourself able, you are not a person who knows Jesus well. The person who knows Jesus knows who they are. And in finding Jesus, actually becomes more themselves. As they become more like God, they are becoming more truly themselves, not pursuing these crazy things with their desires totally disordered, but actually finding God at the core of their heart, seeing that everything in them longs for God. And whenever they give in to that, they actually become who they were made to be. They become most truly themselves. And so I want to invite you, as we have all these questions on our mind as we move into book 8, I also want to ask you to be considering, who are you? Who do you think you are? Do you resonate with Augustine? Do you find yourself trying to define yourself by the people around you, or how attractive you think you are, or how good at sports or academics you think you are? Do you define yourself by what you think other people think of you? If other people think you're smart or an idiot, is that shaping you? Or are you recognizing and learning how to love yourself for God's sake? Becoming like God in such a way that you love yourself the way that God loves you. Those are my questions for you. Enjoy book 8. Have fun with this reading. I think it'll make you cry in a really wonderful way. Thanks, guys.